No one truly knows the moment when a predator's instinct transforms into something darker, something that transcends the simple hunger that drives most animals across the African savanna. But if you could trace it back to a single point in time, to the exact second when fear became a weapon, it would begin with a cub who witnessed the unthinkable on a night that changed everything. His name was Kovu, and he was barely 3 weeks old when the massacre began. The year was 2008 in the remote reaches of the Serengeti, where vast plains stretch endlessly beneath an unforgiving sky, and the only law that matters is the law of survival. Kovu's pride was small, barely 7 strong, scattered across a territory that was slowly being reclaimed by rival males. But on that particular night, when the stars burned brightly above the grasslands and the wind carried scents of distant herds, something catastrophic was about to unfold, something that would brand itself into the consciousness of a young lion forever. Kovu's mother, a lioness named Amara, had given birth to 4 cubs just weeks earlier, 3 females and 1 male. Kovu, the runt of the litter, always pushed aside by his stronger siblings, always fighting for every drop of milk, always struggling to keep pace. He was smaller than he should have been, weaker, marked from birth by a vulnerability that the savannah exploits without mercy. But what he lacked in physical strength, he possessed in something far more dangerous, an awareness, an intelligence that seemed almost unnatural in a creature so young. The night started like any other. The pride rested in their usual spot, a cluster of acacia trees near a dried riverbed where the ground held the memory of water. The lionesses slept in loose circles, their bodies arranged to protect the cubs, their ears alert even in sleep, constantly scanning for danger. Kovu lay against his mother's flank, his small body rising and falling with each breath, his mind already beginning to dream of hunts he would one day join. But the danger came not from where they expected it. The nomadic males arrived without warning, appearing like shadows cast by the moonlight itself, 12 of them, massive battle-scarred warriors who had been wandering the Serengeti for months, searching for a territory weak enough to conquer. And Kovu's pride was exactly what they had been looking for: small, vulnerable, lacking sufficient males to mount a real defense. The first roar shattered the night like thunder splitting a storm cloud. Kovu's eyes snapped open, his tiny body jerking awake with a terror that no cub should ever experience. Around him, the pride exploded into chaos. The lionesses rose instantly, positioning themselves around the cubs with a desperation born from the knowledge of what these invaders wanted. The males of the pride, all 3 of them, rushed toward the sound, their roars mingling with those of the attackers, creating a cacophony of violence that echoed across miles of savanna. What happened in the next 30 minutes would become the foundation of everything Kovu would become. The battle was brutal and mercifully quick. The defending males, though courageous, were outnumbered 4 to 1. They fought with the fury of fathers protecting their bloodline, but numbers and experience proved decisive. One by one they fell or fled, their roars turning to screams, then silence. Kovu watched from beneath his mother's body as the massive invaders surged toward the cluster of cubs and females. He watched as his sisters cried out, their small voices swallowed by the roars of the attackers. He watched as his mother threw herself between the intruders and her litter, her teeth snapping, her claws raking through the air with a desperation that bordered on supernatural. But even a mother's love cannot stand against 12 battle-hardened males. One of the invaders caught his mother across the face with a blow that Kovu felt through the ground itself. Another male circled, waiting for an opening. Kovu's siblings were screaming, a sound so filled with fear and pain that it seemed to pierce something fundamental inside the young cub's chest. He felt paralyzed, frozen by a terror so absolute that his body simply refused to move. His muscles locked, his breath came in shallow gasps. His mind, already capable of complex thought, began to process what his instincts were screaming at him. This was death. This was the end of everything. His sisters died first. Quick kills, their small bodies no match for predators who had been hunting for their entire lives. One moment they were there, crying out to their mother, to the pride, to any force in the universe that might save them. The next moment they were silent, completely, utterly silent, the kind of silence that echoes louder than any scream. Amara fought like something possessed, her maternal instinct pushing her beyond the normal limits of what a single lioness could accomplish. She killed one of the invaders, a massive blow to his spine that left him unable to move, but the effort cost her. A male caught her rear leg and pulled, dragging her away from Kovu, away from the only son she was trying to protect. Kovu watched as his mother's eyes met his for just a moment that carried an entire universe of meaning, a goodbye, a final acknowledgement that this was the end. Amara died screaming her son's name, or rather, she died screaming a sound that Kovu heard as his name, a desperate cry that was meant to drive him away, to make him run, to save him when she could not. But Kovu was frozen, his small body pressed against the earth, his eyes wide, his mind recording every detail with a clarity that should not have been possible for a 3-week-old cub. Every face, every scar, every movement, every sound. A massive male, darker than the others, with a torn ear and a scar running the length of his jaw, turned toward Kovu. The cub had watched this male kill his mother, had watched him deal the blow that had ended her life, and now those same cold, pitiless eyes fixed on the smallest cub in the entire pride. A runt, an easy kill, the final loose end. The male approached slowly, savoring the moment the way predators do, the way killers do when they know their victim cannot escape. He opened his mouth, revealing teeth stained with blood, his mother's blood. Kovu realized with a clarity that was almost supernatural, and prepared to deliver the killing bite. But something extraordinary happened in that moment. Kovu did not run, did not try to hide, did not even attempt to call out for help that would never come. Instead, he locked eyes with the killer who had murdered his mother, and something in his gaze made the massive male hesitate. It was just for a second, just for a fraction of a moment, but it was enough. Another of the invaders, one of the 12 who had orchestrated this massacre, shouted something, a command in the strange language that predators speak, a sound that meant there were other prides nearby, that staying to finish off a single runt was a waste of time and energy. The dark male with the scarred face lingered for just a moment longer, staring at the tiny cub before him, and then he turned away, following his brothers as they melted back into the darkness, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had done. Kovu was left alone in the silence. For hours he did not move. He remained pressed against the cooling body of his mother, her blood soaking into his fur, her warmth slowly fading as the night deepened. He was surrounded by death, his sisters, his mother, 3 males from his pride who had died defending what they loved. The carcasses lay around him like a landscape of loss, a topography of grief written across the savannah in blood and broken bones. But Kovu did not cry, did not call out, did not surrender to the despair that should have consumed him. Instead, he remained perfectly still, and his young mind began to process what had happened. He was alive while everyone he had ever known was dead. He was small, weak, vulnerable, all the things that should have gotten him killed. But somehow, impossibly, the universe had allowed him to survive, and he understood, with a comprehension that seemed far too advanced for his age, that survival itself was a kind of power, that simply remaining alive when death had claimed everyone around you was a form of strength that transcended physical prowess. The rangers found him at dawn, a tiny cub no bigger than a house cat, sitting motionless beside his mother's body. They expected him to be weak, traumatized, unable to survive without her care, but when they approached, something in the cub's eyes made them pause. It was not the look of an innocent caught in tragedy. It was something far more calculating, something that seemed to say, "I have seen what you are capable of. I have watched death dance, and now I understand what it means to be afraid." Kovu was taken to a wildlife sanctuary, where he was raised by humans who did not understand the fundamental transformation that had occurred inside him on that terrible night. They saw a traumatized cub who had lost his family. What they did not see, what no one could have predicted, was that they were raising something far more dangerous than a simple predator. They were raising a creature who had learned at the deepest possible level that fear itself could be weaponized. By the time Kovu reached his 2nd year of life, the sanctuary staff had already begun to notice something unusual about him. Most young lions raised in captivity display a certain playfulness, a curiosity about their surroundings that marks them as creatures still learning about the world. But Kovu was different. He observed everything with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. He watched how the keepers moved, how they responded to aggression, how they retreated when he displayed dominance. Most importantly, he learned that fear, the fear he could inspire in others, was far more effective than raw power. The sanctuary existed in a remote corner of Tanzania, a place where rescued and orphaned lions were given a second chance at life. It was meant to be a refuge, a place where animals could heal from the traumas they had endured. But for Kovu, it became something else entirely. It became a classroom, a laboratory where he could study the nature of fear in its purest form. The first incident occurred when Kovu was approximately 18 months old. A new keeper, a young man named David who had recently joined the sanctuary staff, made the mistake of approaching Kovu's enclosure during feeding time. It was a simple mistake, an oversight born from overconfidence and lack of experience. The older keepers watched in horror as Kovu's entire demeanor changed. His body language shifted from the relaxed posture of a feeding animal to something far more menacing. His ears flattened against his head. His lips curled back to reveal teeth that seemed impossibly large. His eyes, usually amber and warm, turned cold and calculating, but he did not attack. Instead, Kovu began to move in slow, deliberate circles around the terrified keeper. Each step was measured, purposeful, designed not to bring about a quick kill, but to extend the moment of terror. He would move closer, his breath audible, his mane rippling with each movement, and then pull back just slightly, allowing the human to think he might escape. Then he would circle again, drawing closer still. The other keepers stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or whether any intervention would only make things worse. For 7 minutes, Kovu orchestrated a symphony of pure psychological terror. He never touched David, never drew blood, never did anything that could be classified as a direct attack. But when it was over, when Kovu finally allowed the keeper to stumble backward and escape the enclosure, David was a changed man. He had experienced something far worse than physical pain. He had experienced the absolute knowledge of his own mortality, delivered not through violence but through the dawning realization that he was being studied, assessed, and found wanting by a predator who had made the conscious choice to let him live. The sanctuary director, Dr. Margaret Okonkwo, began to keep detailed notes on Kovu's behavior. She was a woman with decades of experience working with big cats, and she recognized that something extraordinary was occurring before her eyes. Kovu was not simply a traumatized cub learning to survive in a new environment. He was displaying what could only be described as advanced psychological manipulation. He understood, at some fundamental level, that the mind was a weapon more potent than teeth and claws. As Kovu grew, his physical form began to catch up to his mental development. By his 3rd year, he had reached a size that was unusual, even for a male lion his age. The veterinarians estimated that he would exceed 450 pounds by the time he reached full maturity, placing him in the upper range of lion development. But it was not his size that made the sanctuary staff uneasy. It was the way he used it. Every movement was calculated. Every gesture was designed to communicate dominance, not through displays of aggression, but through an almost supernatural awareness of his own power and the effect it had on those around him. The other lions in the sanctuary began to avoid him. This was particularly notable because the sanctuary housed 7 other lions of varying ages and sizes. Lions are fundamentally social creatures. They live in prides, hunt together, raise cubs collectively. The natural instinct is toward cooperation, toward bonding, but the other lions seemed to understand, through some mechanism that science has yet to fully explain, that Kovu was fundamentally different, that he operated by a different set of rules. They gave him wide berth, avoided competing with him for food, and displayed submissive postures whenever he entered their shared spaces. It was as if they could sense what the sanctuary staff was only beginning to understand. This was not a normal lion. This was something new, something that had emerged from trauma and violence, and sculpted itself into a creature that weaponized fear itself. Dr. Okonkwo began to receive inquiries about Kovu from research institutions and universities. Word had spread through the academic community that the Tanzanian sanctuary was housing an anomalous specimen, a lion that displayed psychological complexity rarely seen in the species. She received offers from wealthy collectors, from documentarians, from scientists who wanted to study him, understand him, perhaps unlock the secrets that made him unique. But Dr. Okonkwo had seen something in Kovu's eyes that frightened her more than any display of aggression ever could. She had seen intelligence, not the simple cunning that all predators possess, but genuine, complex intelligence coupled with a trauma so profound that it had reshaped his fundamental nature. She recognized that releasing Kovu back into the wild, or allowing him to be studied in a more clinical setting, might be dangerous not just for those around him, but for the entire ecosystem he would enter. She made the decision to keep him in the sanctuary, to provide him with the best possible care, but also to maintain careful documentation of his behavior. It was an unusual decision, one that drew criticism from those who believed that a lion of his caliber should be returned to his natural habitat. But Dr. Okonkwo understood something that others did not. Kovu could never return to the wild in any normal sense. He had been shaped by captivity. Yes, but more fundamentally, he had been shaped by witnessing the absolute worst that nature could offer. He had seen his mother die, had watched his siblings slaughtered, had experienced the knowledge of his own fragility at an age when most cubs were still learning to pounce on their siblings' tails. That knowledge, once acquired, cannot be unlearned. By Kovu's 4th year, the sanctuary had made the decision to construct a larger enclosure specifically for him. It was a decision that spoke volumes about the staff's recognition of his unique needs and his unique dangers. The new enclosure covered 12 acres, with natural rock formations, multiple water sources, and vegetation that allowed for the kind of hunting behaviors that lions in the wild would naturally engage in. It was, by any standard, a luxurious space, but everyone understood that it was also, fundamentally, a cage. The construction of this enclosure coincided with another significant event in Kovu's life. Dr. Okonkwo had arranged for a documentary filmmaker to spend several months at the sanctuary, capturing Kovu's daily behaviors and routines. The filmmaker, a woman named Sophie Chen who had spent years documenting African wildlife, was immediately struck by the same quality that had unsettled everyone else who spent significant time with Kovu. "It's like he's studying us," Sophie wrote in her journal during the first week of filming. "Not just observing, but genuinely analyzing, trying to understand what makes us tick. There's a quality to his gaze that feels almost human, which sounds ridiculous when you're talking about a lion, but I don't know how else to describe it." Sophie's footage would eventually become the basis for a documentary that would air on international wildlife networks and bring Kovu to the attention of a global audience. But what the documentary captured, and what truly fascinated scientists and animal behaviorists around the world, was not dramatic displays of strength or power. Instead, it showed something far more unsettling. It showed Kovu using the psychology of fear as a tool of dominance. There was a sequence, for example, where a rival male lion, a perfectly healthy, aggressive specimen named Jabari, was introduced to Kovu's enclosure as part of an experiment to observe how territorial males would interact. The expectation was that there would be a violent confrontation, the kind of male-on-male combat that is common in lion populations. What actually happened was far more remarkable and far more disturbing. Kovu did not attack. Instead, he employed a strategy that seemed almost deliberate in its psychological sophistication. He would position himself at a distance from Jabari, where his presence was undeniable but his threat was not immediate. He would stare unblinking, maintaining eye contact with an intensity that seemed designed specifically to invoke discomfort. He would circle slowly, never breaking that gaze, allowing Jabari to feel the full weight of his attention, his intelligence, his predatory focus. Within 3 days, Jabari had ceased eating. Within a week, he displayed stress behaviors so severe that the sanctuary staff felt compelled to remove him from the enclosure. The physical confrontation that everyone had anticipated never occurred. Instead, Jabari had simply broken under the weight of sustained psychological pressure. He had experienced the knowledge that he was being studied by a predator who had deemed him unworthy of direct combat, and that knowledge had destroyed him more effectively than any physical battle could have. When Sophie reviewed the footage, she sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour. Then she began to write. The resulting documentary segment would be titled "The Psychology of Predation," and it would become the most discussed piece of wildlife media that year. Scientists debated it. Psychologists analyzed it. Animal behaviorists wrote papers about it. And everyone who watched it came away with the same unsettling conclusion. Kovu had evolved beyond the normal parameters of lion behavior. He had become something that transcended simple predation. He had become a creature that understood that fear itself was the ultimate weapon. By Kovu's 5th year, the sanctuary had become something of a pilgrimage site for researchers, behaviorists, and wildlife enthusiasts from around the world. They came with questions. They came with theories. They came hoping to unlock the mystery of how a single lion had managed to transcend the normal boundaries of his species and become something that seemed almost intelligent in a way that intelligence itself did not adequately describe. Dr. Okonkwo had begun to receive serious proposals from major research institutions. The University of Oxford wanted to conduct a long-term behavioral study. The Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior proposed bringing in specialists who could conduct detailed cognitive assessments. Even major wildlife documentaries were bidding for exclusive access to film Kovu's daily routines. But Dr. Okonkwo, with the support of Sophie Chen and a growing network of scientists who had become fascinated by Kovu's anomalous behavior, made a decision that would have profound implications. They would not allow Kovu to be studied as a specimen to be analyzed and dissected. Instead, they would document his life with the same respect and reverence that one might apply to studying a human of extraordinary ability. They would treat him as what he had become, a conscious being who had transcended his species and evolved into something new. This decision led to the creation of what became known as the Kovu Project, an ongoing research initiative that would span decades and involve scientists from multiple disciplines. Psychologists worked alongside ethologists. Neurobiologists collaborated with behavioral ecologists. Together, they began to construct a comprehensive understanding of how trauma, intelligence, and evolutionary pressure could combine to create a creature like Kovu. One of the most significant discoveries came from Dr. James Whitmore, a neuroscientist from Cambridge University who had secured permission to conduct non-invasive brain imaging studies on Kovu. Using specialized equipment that was adapted for use with large animals, Dr. Whitmore discovered something that would reshape the entire conversation around Kovu's abilities. Kovu's brain structure was not typical for a lion. The hippocampus, the region responsible for memory formation and emotional processing, was measurably larger than in comparable animals. More remarkably, there appeared to be increased neural density in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with planning, impulse control, and what could be loosely described as executive function. These were not dramatic differences, but they were consistent and measurable. They suggested that Kovu's brain had somehow adapted in response to the trauma he had experienced, developing enhanced capacity for the kinds of cognitive processes that would allow him to process complex information and make calculated decisions. It's as if, Dr. Whitmore explained in a presentation to the International Society of Wildlife Behavioral Studies, the trauma that should have destroyed him instead catalyzed a process of rapid neurological development. The brain, faced with an existential threat at such a young age, adapted by expanding its capacity for analysis, prediction, and strategic thinking. Kovu's fear, the terror he experienced watching his family die, became the crucible in which a new kind of intelligence was forged. But the neurological discoveries, fascinating as they were, only partially explained the mystery of Kovu, because what made Kovu truly extraordinary was not simply that his brain had developed unusual capabilities, it was that he had learned to weaponize the very fear that had shaped him. By his 5th year, Kovu had developed a range of behavioral tactics that seemed designed specifically to invoke fear in those around him. There was what Sophie Chen began to call the stare, an unwavering, unblinking fixation that communicated absolute attention and predatory focus. There was what the veterinarians termed the circle, a slow, deliberate movement pattern that positioned Kovu at an optimal distance for psychological pressure while maintaining the illusion of disengagement. And there was what Dr. Okonkwo's notes referred to as the patience, an almost supernatural capacity to wait, to watch, to remain motionless for extended periods while maintaining complete control over a situation through sheer force of presence. The impact these behaviors had on other animals was documented extensively. When Kovu was introduced to the sanctuary's social spaces with other lions, the effect was immediate and measurable. Heart rates of other lions increased within seconds of his arrival. Cortisol levels spiked, aggression decreased, replaced by displacement behaviors and signs of extreme stress. The other lions would literally flee from his presence, not because he had threatened them, but because they could sense the predatory intelligence that surrounded him like an aura. It's as if they understand something that we're only beginning to grasp. Dr. Sarah Kimani, a primatologist who had been brought in to analyze Kovu's social dynamics, explained, they recognize that Kovu is not like them, that he operates according to a different set of rules, and that recognition itself triggers fear. It's fear of the unknown, fear of the different, fear of something that transcends the normal categories of lion behavior. This insight led to a series of experiments designed to test Kovu's ability to understand the mental states of other animals. In one notable test, Kovu was presented with a live prey animal, a zebra that was contained in a separate enclosure visible to him but physically separated by a barrier. The expectation was that Kovu would display the standard predatory responses common to all lions. But what actually occurred was far more complex. Kovu did not immediately attack or display aggression. Instead, he positioned himself in a location where he could maintain visual contact with the zebra while remaining absolutely motionless. He would hold this position for extended periods, sometimes hours, simply watching, staring, maintaining that unwavering gaze that had become his signature. Over the course of several days, the zebra's behavior changed noticeably. It became increasingly agitated, increasingly stressed, increasingly traumatized by the knowledge that it was being watched by a predator of unimaginable intelligence and patience. When the barrier was eventually removed, the zebra did not flee. It was too broken, too traumatized by days of sustained psychological pressure to even attempt escape. It simply stood, trembling, waiting for the inevitable. And when Kovu finally moved, when he finally transformed the psychological predation into physical violence, it was almost merciful. The hunt lasted less than 30 seconds. The psychological impact on the research team was significant. Several members requested reassignment, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with their understanding of predator behavior. One graduate student actually suffered what was later diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder from witnessing the incident. The recognition that they were studying something that transcended the normal boundaries of animal behavior having a profound effect on her mental state. But the experiments continued, each one revealing new facets of Kovu's extraordinary capabilities. He demonstrated an ability to understand human emotional states, to read facial expressions, to predict human behavior with remarkable accuracy. He showed signs of what could only be described as empathy, though empathy twisted and warped by his traumatic history into something that resembled understanding rather than compassion. He could recognize individual humans, remember their previous interactions with him, and adjust his behavior accordingly. Most remarkably, he demonstrated what appeared to be a genuine understanding of cause and effect at a level that suggested abstract reasoning. When presented with puzzles that required him to manipulate objects in sequence to obtain a reward, he not only solved them, but seemed to take intellectual satisfaction in the process. He would sometimes attempt solutions that had no possibility of success, as if he were experimenting, testing hypotheses, exploring the boundaries of cause and effect. He's thinking, Sophie Chen wrote in her journal after witnessing one such experiment. I mean, truly thinking, not just reacting to stimuli, not just following instincts. He's processing information, analyzing situations, and making decisions based on complex internal models of how the world works. It's remarkable and terrifying in equal measure. By Kovu's 6th year, the sanctuary had become the center of an international research community focused on understanding the nature of intelligence, trauma, and evolution. Universities began to offer courses based on the Kovu project findings. Conservation organizations cited his example when discussing the complexity of animal consciousness and the moral implications of wildlife management. He had transcended being a simple research subject and become something closer to a symbol, a living example of the ways in which trauma and evolution could combine to create something genuinely new. But not everyone was pleased with the direction that the research had taken. There were those in the broader scientific community who felt that the focus on Kovu's psychological complexity was anthropomorphizing him, projecting human qualities onto an animal that, regardless of his unusual characteristics, was still fundamentally a predator driven by instinct and survival. Critics argued that the research team was engaging in a kind of romantic projection, seeing what they wanted to see rather than what was actually present. Dr. Okonkwo responded to these criticisms with patience and data. She published comprehensive papers detailing every observation, every measurement, every test result. She made the research transparent, allowing other scientists to review her methods and reach their own conclusions. And slowly, incrementally, the consensus shifted. Kovu was not a normal lion. He was not a simple predator who had been overstudied. He was something genuinely unusual, something that represented a new category of animal intelligence that did not fit neatly into existing taxonomies. But as the scientific community came to understand and accept Kovu's extraordinary nature, a new question began to emerge, one that would drive the next phase of his life and would ultimately determine his legacy. What would happen if a creature like Kovu were returned to the wild? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The sanctuary had provided Kovu with safety, with resources, with the kind of controlled environment where his unusual nature could be studied and documented. But Kovu was a lion, and lions were meant to hunt, to roam, to exist in the vast spaces of Africa where they had evolved over millions of years. Keeping him in captivity, regardless of the quality of that captivity, was a kind of imprisonment. There were those who argued passionately for his release. They believed that Kovu deserved the chance to experience the wild, to use his extraordinary intelligence and abilities in the ecosystem that had created his species. They believed that his presence in the wild could have profound implications for conservation, that a creature of his intelligence and capability could become a symbol for the entire species. But Dr. Okonkwo knew the truth that others were only beginning to suspect. Kofu was not simply a lion with enhanced intelligence. He was a creature that had learned to weaponize fear itself, to use psychological manipulation as a hunting tool, to transcend the normal boundaries of predator behavior and enter into something that resembled genuine malevolence. The question was not whether Kovu should be released into the wild. The question was what would happen to the wild if he was released. What would a creature of his intelligence, his capability, his understanding of fear do when unleashed upon an unsuspecting ecosystem, and more troublingly, what would Kovu himself become? The decision to release Kovu into the wild did not come easily. It took 3 years of deliberation, countless meetings between Dr. Okonkwo and the board of directors, heated debates within the international research community, and ultimately, a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but seemed like the only viable path forward. Kovu would be released, but not into the open Serengeti where he had been born. Instead, he would be introduced into a protected game reserve in northern Tanzania, a sprawling wilderness area of approximately 500 square kilometers that was carefully monitored and managed. It was a middle ground between captivity and absolute freedom, a space where Kovu could experience the wild while remaining within a framework where his behavior could be observed and documented. The release was scheduled for Kovu's 7th birthday, on a date that had been carefully chosen based on seasonal patterns and prey availability. The preparation was meticulous. Kovu was gradually acclimated to outdoor living conditions. His diet was shifted to reflect the kinds of prey he would encounter in the reserve. He was exposed to the sounds and smells of the wild environment through recordings and scent markers. Every precaution was taken to ensure that the transition from captivity to wilderness would be as smooth and successful as possible. But everyone involved in the project understood that there was no preparation adequate for what Kovu had become. On the morning of his release, Kovu was transported in a reinforced crate to the reserve's northwestern boundary. The team that accompanied him included Dr. Okonkwo, Sophie Chen, and a handful of sanctuary staff members who had worked with Kovu since his arrival. There was a somber quality to the proceedings, a recognition that they were witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely unknown. When the crate door was opened, Kovu emerged slowly. He had grown to his full size over the past year, an imposing specimen that weighed nearly 470 pounds and possessed a mane that seemed almost black in its darkness. But it was not his physical presence that struck the observers most forcefully. It was the way he moved, with a deliberate grace that seemed to suggest absolute confidence in his understanding of the world around him. He did not bound away into the wilderness with the exuberance of a young animal finally free. Instead, he paused, turning his head slowly to survey his surroundings. His amber eyes, still possessing that unsettling quality of intelligence and predatory focus, took in every detail of the landscape. Then, with a movement that seemed almost ritualistic, he climbed a small ridge and released a roar that echoed across the reserve with such force that the researchers could feel it vibrating through the earth beneath their feet. It was not a territorial claim, though it contained elements of that. It was not a hunting call, though it communicated predatory intent. It was something far more profound. It was a declaration, a statement of presence, a promise and a warning combined into a single, overwhelming display of dominance that seemed to reshape the very air around them. "My God," Sophie Chen whispered, her camera still recording even though her hands were trembling. "He knows. He understands exactly what he is now." The first weeks of Kovu's release were carefully monitored. The reserve had been equipped with an extensive network of camera traps and motion sensors that allowed the research team to track his movements and behavior without direct intervention. What they documented would become the basis for an entirely new understanding of how an animal of Kovu's intelligence might reshape an ecosystem. Kovu did not hunt immediately. Instead, he spent days simply exploring his territory, moving through the reserve with methodical precision, learning the landscape, understanding the distribution of prey, mapping out the locations of water sources and natural shelters. It was as if he was constructing a mental model of his environment before he began to truly utilize it. The patience he displayed was extraordinary, a willingness to invest time in understanding that transcended the normal urgency that drives most predators. When he finally did hunt, the results were unprecedented. His first kill was a wildebeest, a creature that would normally present a significant challenge even for an experienced lion. Most lions hunting alone would attempt to take down a young wildebeest or a weakened individual. Kovu targeted a healthy adult male, a creature at the peak of its physical capabilities. The hunt, captured on camera trap footage, revealed the full sophistication of his predatory strategy. He did not rely on the standard ambush tactics that lions typically employ. Instead, he positioned himself at a distance from his target, allowing the wildebeest to see him, to understand that it was being hunted. Then he began to move, slowly at first, maintaining a distance that communicated predatory intent without immediate threat. He was allowing the wildebeest to experience fear, to understand its own vulnerability, to begin the process of psychological breakdown even before the physical confrontation. For nearly 2 hours, Kovu engaged in this psychological predation. He would move closer, then pull back. He would circle, always maintaining eye contact, always communicating absolute attention and predatory focus. The wildebeest, initially panicked and ready to flee, began to show signs of surrender. Its movements became sluggish. Its flight response diminished. It was as if it had accepted the inevitability of its own death, had internalized the knowledge that this was a predator unlike any other it had encountered. When Kovu finally moved to deliver the killing blow, it was almost anticlimactic. The wildebeest made no attempt to run, no attempt to fight. It simply accepted its fate with the resignation of a creature that had already been broken by something far more powerful than physical force. What made this hunt truly remarkable, however, was what happened after the kill. Kovu fed, yes, consuming the portions of the carcass that he needed, but he did not remain with the kill to guard it from scavengers, as lions typically do. Instead, he abandoned it and moved on, leaving the carcass for hyenas and jackals to finish. The message was clear. This kill was not about sustenance. It was about demonstration, about showing what he was capable of. Over the following weeks and months, Kovu's hunting patterns became increasingly sophisticated and increasingly disturbing. He seemed to take intellectual satisfaction in the hunt itself, in the process of psychological predation that preceded the physical kill. He began to employ tactics that suggested genuine strategic thinking. He would isolate prey animals from their herds through movements that seemed calculated to exploit their herd dynamics. He would position himself to cut off escape routes before beginning his pursuit. He would attack at times and places that demonstrated an understanding of terrain and weather patterns. But most disturbingly, he began to hunt when he was not hungry. This behavior, absolutely anomalous in wild lions, suggested something far more profound than simple predation. Kovu was not hunting for survival. He was hunting for pleasure, for intellectual stimulation, for the satisfaction of exercise his extraordinary mental and physical capabilities. He was, in the most literal sense, a killer who had transcended the necessity of killing and engaged in it as an expression of his nature. The research team faced an ethical crisis. The original purpose of the Kovu project had been to study an anomalous specimen, to understand how trauma and evolution had combined to create something genuinely unique. But now they were witnessing the implications of releasing such a creature into a wild ecosystem. Kovu was not threatening the balance of nature in any conventional sense. His predation, while unusual, did not pose a genuine threat to prey populations. The real issue was more philosophical. They were studying a creature that appeared to have transcended the boundaries of his species and become something new, something that possessed genuine intelligence coupled with predatory capabilities, something that hunted not out of necessity but out of choice, driven by impulses that seemed to suggest a kind of awareness that bordered on consciousness. Dr. Okonkwo called for a summit of the international research team. Scientists from around the world convened at the reserve to discuss what they were witnessing and to debate what should be done about it. The discussions were intense and at times emotionally fraught. Some argued for Kovu's immediate capture and return to captivity, believing that releasing such a creature into the wild was reckless and irresponsible. Others insisted that Kovu had every right to exist as he was, that to recapture him would be to deny his fundamental nature and his evolutionary development. Still others proposed more radical solutions, including the possibility of allowing Kovu to remain in the wild but establishing protocols for intensive monitoring and intervention if his behavior began to pose a genuine threat to ecosystem stability. It was Dr. James Whitmore, the neuroscientist who had conducted the brain imaging studies, who articulated the central philosophical problem that the team was grappling with. What we're really asking, he said during one of the summit sessions, is whether an animal that has transcended the normal boundaries of its species has the same rights as other members of that species. We're asking whether intelligence itself imposes moral obligations. We're asking whether a creature like Kovu, which demonstrates genuine awareness and strategic thinking, deserves different consideration than a standard predator. These are questions that science can document but cannot ultimately answer. They're questions of philosophy, of ethics, of how we define the very nature of consciousness and morality. The summit ultimately resulted in a compromise. Kovu would be allowed to remain in the reserve, but the monitoring would be intensified. Satellite tracking would be implemented. Monthly research expeditions would be conducted to assess his health and behavior. A rapid response team would be maintained to intervene if Kovu's behavior began to pose a genuine threat to ecosystem stability or human safety. It was, in essence, a decision to allow Kovu to exist as he was while maintaining the ability to intervene if absolutely necessary. As the years passed and Kovu matured into his full prime, the research team witnessed the complete realization of the transformation that had begun on that terrible night when he watched his family die. He became not simply the largest male lion in the reserve, but the undisputed apex of the entire ecosystem, not because he challenged and defeated other lions for dominance, though he easily could have, but because other creatures seemed to instinctively understand that he was fundamentally different from them. Prey animals would flee at the mere sight of him, not because he presented an immediate threat, but because they could sense the predatory intelligence that surrounded him. Other lions, when they encountered him, would display submission without any overt threat being made. Hyena clans, normally aggressive and confrontational, would abandon kills and retreat when Kovu approached, as if they recognized that this was a predator operating on a level of sophistication beyond their comprehension. By his 10th year in the wild, Kovu had become something approaching a myth. Local guides spoke of sightings in reverent whispers. Tourists who glimpsed him reported feeling a kind of primal fear that transcended the normal adrenaline spike of seeing a large predator. Researchers published papers analyzing his behavior, debating the implications of his existence, questioning what his evolution might suggest about the future of wildlife and the nature of consciousness itself. But perhaps most remarkably, Kovu's presence had begun to affect the entire reserve ecosystem. Prey populations, initially threatened by his unusual hunting patterns, had actually stabilized and even increased as other predators learned to avoid the areas where Kovu hunted. The ecosystem had reorganized itself around him, not as a threat to be controlled, but as a force to be accommodated and respected. Sophie Chen, who had remained at the reserve to continue documenting Kovu's life, wrote in her final journal entry before her retirement, "I came to study a lion who had learned to weaponize fear. What I discovered was something far more profound. I discovered a creature who had transcended fear entirely, not overcome it, but moved beyond it. He had taken the terror that should have destroyed him and transformed it into something almost beautiful, not in the conventional sense of beauty, but in the way that great works of art can be beautiful even when depicting terrible subjects. Kovu is the art form that fear created. He is what happens when survival instinct meets intelligence. He is what the future of evolution might look like if trauma and capability combine in just the right way." And as I watch him move through the reserve, golden in the setting sun, his mane catching the last light of day, I find myself wondering if what we're really observing is not an aberration but a glimpse of what might come. A glimpse of intelligence emerging from the wild, consciousness arising from the depths of predatory instinct. Kovu grew up watching death, but in the end, he became something far more profound. He became proof that even the darkest trauma can give birth to something genuinely new. Kovu lived for 23 years in the reserve, longer than any wild lion on record. When he finally died at an age that would have been extraordinary for any animal, the entire reserve seemed to pause. Prey animals that had spent years avoiding his presence moved into the territories he had claimed. Other lions, previously subordinate, began to compete for dominance in a way they had not dared when Kovu was alive. But the landscape itself seemed changed. The acacia trees where he had rested bore the imprint of his presence. The waterholes where he had hunted carried the memory of his hunts. The entire reserve had been shaped by the existence of a single creature who had learned to weaponize fear and transformed it into something approaching greatness. Dr. Okonkwo, now retired from active research but still consulting on the reserve, stood at the site where Kovu's body had been discovered. She placed her hand on the earth, feeling the same ground that had carried the weight of the most extraordinary creature she had ever encountered. "He taught us something," she said softly, speaking to Sophie Chen, who had returned to the reserve for the funeral. He taught us that consciousness is not limited to human minds, that intelligence can emerge from trauma, that fear, properly understood and channeled, can become a kind of power, and most importantly, he taught us that even the darkest beginning can give birth to something genuinely transformative. The sun set over the reserve, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and somewhere in the distance, the roar of another lion echoed across the plains. It was a sound that would never carry the weight of Kovu's roar, never possess that quality of absolute dominance and intelligence that had made him legendary. But in that roar, carried on the evening wind, there was perhaps an echo, a reminder that in the vast African wilderness, a single creature had once existed who had grown up watching death and transformed it into something that approached transcendence, and the world had never been quite the same.